everybody. It is so good to see all of your faces. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. Aren't we happy that the rain cleared and the sun came out in time for us to come to the show tonight? I am so happy about that because we have just stories full of sunshine that are just going to lighten your heart when you hear them tonight. We've got stories from artists, poets, leaders, all kinds of wonderful people from right here in Jonesborough and from the greater Appalachian region. And we are also featuring a great singing group tonight. We've got We Five here. We Four. It's the same. And I know that the fifth singer is going to be singing with you all from above, Mr. Alfred Greenlee. Isn't that right? That's right. We have also, I'm just thrilled that Langley Shazer is joining us again. Langley is just an incredible poet. You're going to hear a lot more about him later on. But Langley has one last book of his poetry, of his poetry. So I wanted to ask, who in here thinks they came the furthest tonight?
I came from the North Pole.
Aside from Katie the elf. So did anybody come all the way from Johnson City? Yes. Did anybody come from further than Johnson City? Where? Greenville? Greenville? Anybody else? Who thinks, if you think, don't be shy. If you're shy, you'll get rid of it tonight because you just walked into a room of 100 new friends, didn't you? Where did you?
I'm from Taiwan.
I think we have a winner. You get to take home Langley with you tonight, okay? So why don't we pass this back to our, this is his card. So we'll keep that in his book, so you can use it as a bookmark. Let's pass that back to our winner. So we just have a couple of housekeeping rules. First, we are doing an old-fashioned radio show, which back in those days, if you wanted to call somebody, you had to pick up the thingy and you got to crank it and you have to ask for Sarah. And they didn't have these things. Now, if you do have one of these things, set it for stun. You can check in, but if you want to take pictures, as long as the flash isn't going, that's great, because you don't want one of us falling in your lap, right? But if you want to take pictures and tag the Yarn Exchange, tag the Mckinney Center, tag the International Storytelling Center, and check in and let everybody know what you were doing tonight, okay? So I'm not going to make you put them away. I'm not that mean. I'm just saying set them for stun, right? Okay. In case of an emergency, you can go out the door you came in. There's also a door that way. Or you can follow Gary because he will be the first one out. Gary's our wonderful sound effects Foley operator, so all the wonderful neat sounds that you're going to hear throughout the show, he's going to take care of. So I just want to thank you all so much for coming to this show. These are our stories about our people and our community, and I really hope that you like what with the research that we went into this, the stories that you'll hear. And sometimes if a person is on stage saying I did this, it's storytelling, right? We did the research, but now these actors are stepping in the shoes of the people they're telling stories about. I do want to honor a couple of folks who are in the audience tonight before we go any further. Miss Mary McKinney, a story of hers is going to be told tonight. She's sitting in the front row right here. Marion was married to Ernest McKinney, who was the first African-American mayor in the town of Jonesborough. No, first African-American alderman in the town of Jonesborough. Her son became the first African-American mayor in the town of Jonesborough, and Marion was no slouch either. Marion served in the school. She was a counselor. She still served on the election board, right, Marion? Board of Elections. Well, you're going to hear more about her story later on, so I don't want to get too far into it, but it's so good to have you. We've got Sue Greenlee in the audience, and her dad was such an icon in the community. And if you want to hear more of their stories, the play I Am, if you like the radio show, I urge you to come and see the play I Am Home this coming weekend at the McKinney Center, where instead of in front of the microphone here, we bring the stories to life on stage with sets and costumes and everything else. So if you like these stories, we've got even more coming up with I Am Home this coming weekend, Friday, Saturday matinee, Sunday, and Saturday night. Thank you all so much for coming out and enjoy the show. Lori, let's take it away.
Coming to you from Jonesborough, Tennessee, the storytelling capital of the world, and broadcasting from the International Storytelling Center, it's Jonesborough's original storytelling radio hour, A Night with the Yarn Exchange.
At the Jonesborough Yarn Exchange, give us a story and we'll give it a name. We'll get them all together in a brand new play. Tell it the Jonesborough way. Let's get this started now. Toss me a ball and I'll show you how. I'll begin the story and then when I'm through, this ball of yarn gets tossed back to you. Pull the strand and help me weave it through.
It is an exciting night here at the International Storytelling Center in Jonesborough. The Southern Appalachian region is home to many diverse artists, poets, and leaders.
That's right, Lori. You know, when people think of this area, diversity is not really the first thing that comes to mind in most people's minds. But we've seen enough television shows and cartoons that show a certain caricature of our people. But we're much more than that. A few years ago, the poet laureate of Kentucky, Frank X. Walker, came up with a term to describe the African-American influence of art and culture in the Appalachian Mountains. He called it Affalachia.
He did. His book, Affalachia, is used widely in classrooms. It serves as one of the foundational works for African-American poets in Appalachia, like Langley Shazor.
We're so excited to have Langley with us on the show tonight, sharing some of his own rich poetry.
Tonight's show celebrates the Appalachian poets and African-American stories and leaders from this region.
We'll also be celebrating tonight with music, as the wonderful singing group We Five will be joining us for tonight's show.
We're able to bring you tonight's show through the generous support from Ballad Health, medical experts you can trust, world-class facilities, and the latest technologies close to your home. It's your story. We're listening.
Tonight's show is also sponsored by the Tennessee Arts Commission. And of course, frozen toast. Moms, does morning come too early for you? Then frozen toast is the answer. From the freezer to the toaster, what could be simpler than frozen toast? Hit it, kids.
It's a breakfast sensation from coast to coast. What do you want for breakfast, kids? Frozen toast!
Now with a side of salsa!
Thanks, kids. And thank you all for being here tonight. A few years ago, when Frank X. Walker coined the term Affalachia, he also said he wanted to make the invisible visible. Marianne is here to tell us a little bit more about Frank X. Walker.
Thanks, Lori. Walker meant that he meant that same thing in more than one way. First of all, he understood that statistically speaking, there are fewer African Americans in the Appalachian region than in other places throughout the United States. The contribution from the small minority, however, was not small at all. When you listen to the music and look at the crafts and visual arts coming from this area, there are a lot of African as well as African American influences. One of the musical instruments associated with this region is the banjo. And yet the banjo's roots are found in Africa. There are techniques in basket weaving, singing, storytelling, all with an influence from this often unseen segment of the community. Another way Walker wanted people to think about the invisible is to look at the way they do their work. To understand what he means by this, you just have to look around our own town. We have so many teachers all throughout Jonesborough who do their work so quietly. These leaders you may not even know about.
Our own Donna Olujani is well acquainted with one of these leaders. Donna, would you tell us a little bit about the story of your father?
My father, Elmer Gillespie, has been a life and service to this community, especially through Bethel Christian Church. For the past 15 years, he has been the director of the Jonesborough Area Ministerial Association Food Pantry. Back in 2002, he had been delivering Meals on Wheels and helping people like that. When Pam Daniels, who was with JAMA, told him they had decided to start a food pantry and asked if he'd be interested in working with them. He said yes. He knew there was a need in the community when he worked with Meals on Wheels, but didn't know the extent of which our community was in need until he worked with the food pantry, especially our seniors. So many people didn't have enough food to keep them from hunger.
The Ministerial Association had done an assessment and discovered this, and all of the churches decided it would be a good thing to start. There are volunteers who help with the food pantry from different area churches, but we knew we needed someone dedicated to serve as the director, especially in the beginning.
They have a lot of volunteers now, but when he first started, it was just him and my mother, Claritha. The churches started sending volunteers. Now they have a regular rotation. The food pantry is open every Thursday to provide food to qualifying people and families. The first Thursday of the month, we have volunteers from United Methodist Church. The second Thursday is Bethel Christian Church. The third is from Central Christian. And the fourth, we have volunteers from Presbyterian Church.
I volunteer there myself, and anyone who wants to help volunteer just needs to contact one of those churches. That's what they work through.
I'm someone who is served by the ministry. Mr. Gillespie and the other volunteers have really created an environment that makes me feel respected. Now we have carts and baskets. Every person who comes through those doors is treated with dignity.
In the new food pantry, we get to shop for and choose what we want. In the old days, when they didn't have as much or as many donations, we kind of took what we were given. But now, we have the dignity of a choice.
Isn't that what we all want?
It's possible because of the volunteers, because of donations from the churches and our organizations, and because we've got good people who work with them at the Second Harvest, at Food City for dairy products, and the Dollar Tree for other boxed food items. They've got places like the public library who collect food, and in December, they accept the non-perishable food items in place of late library fees. Nobody should be hungry. This is my father's mission, and I'm so proud of him. He often quotes Proverbs 11:25, which says, "A generous person will prosper, whoever refreshes others with the refreshed." Man cannot live on bread alone, so my dad and others with the ministry pray for those they serve, and when they ask, they pray for them as well.
It is quiet work, almost invisible work, as Frank X. Walker might have said, but caring for others is the most important work any of us can do. Thank you, Donna, for sharing your father's story.
Lori, we've got a dynamic young woman in town who is doing her best to bring visibility to the downtown area, to history, and to the bed and breakfast that she and her husband Blake manage.
You've got to be talking about Caitlin Yarborough with the Eureka Inn.
Also known as our new favorite weekend breakfast spot.
Before we get to Caitlin's story of the Eureka Inn, it might be good to know a little of the history of this iconic building in Jonesborough. It is set on Jonesborough's Main Street for nearly 200 years, just down from the historical courthouse.
In 1797, Robert Mitchell and his wife Harriet purchased lot number 19 from the town of Jonesborough to construct a private residence. Then, in 1851, William Henry Maxwell purchased the home and had a jury room in one of the large bedrooms that still serves as a meeting room today. In 1869, Laura Gosnell purchased the property to be used as a private residence and boarding house. But in 1900, Peter Miller and his wife Harriet opened the Eureka Hotel to offer hospitality to travelers and business people. 10 years later, in 1910, J.R. Russell purchased the inn and added the first bathtub with hot and cold running water. The running water and bathtub served as a big selling point.
In the 1950s, a restaurant, grocery store, and a taxi cab business had taken over the ground floor.
Taxi cabs?
Yes, taxi cabs here in Jonesborough. In 1997, the hotel was restored back to its days of glory and offers the best of past and present, as well as other reminders which we might not call the best of the past, but important artifacts to remember.
There's a history hidden within the walls of most historic buildings, mysteries waiting to be solved. A few years ago, when my husband Blake and I were doing a walkthrough of the Eureka Inn before we were to take over as managers, I noticed this floating door. It doesn't have stairs. We asked the previous innkeeper, what is this?
You know, I don't know what that door was for. I bet I know one person who would know. You should ask Dr. William Kennedy, who restored the building and leads the preservationists in the community.
Yes, that door. Many years ago, during the days of Jim Crow and before that, this was the entrance for the African American people. It was called the colored entrance. The door was here because they weren't allowed to come through the front entrance. I don't know if they were actually able to eat there, but they could pick up their food from that entrance. I'm not sure of any African American people who ever worked at the Eureka.
It's always shocking to hear about the disadvantage that black people had to deal with. But to work in the building, more than work, if you know me, you know I eat, drink, and breathe the Eureka. It is kind of jarring and disappointing to learn this, but also something important. It is scary and comforting, and at the same time, that this door, this reminder of the past, is preserved. But because it is, we have a better understanding of our history and of how far we've come. Why is it important it is preserved? My mom used to say something to me. There once was a man who made mistakes. He enjoyed his mistakes because he learned from them, and he never made the mistakes again. So why keep the door? People should be knowledgeable of history, true history, no matter how gory the details, so they can understand why things may have been the way they have been. Depending on how you absorb it, that history will affect how you will live your life and the future. So here I am, someone who 50 or 60 years ago would have used that side door entrance. But today, in 2018, I'm running the Eureka Inn with my husband. We are doing so many things with the inn. To invite the community inside, as we've done in the past, we're serving breakfast and brunch, having dinner theater shows, and offer the courtyard for weddings and other occasions. There's a lot to celebrate here, and a lot of honor here. Blake and I are going to repaint the door and hang a plaque so everyone who will know what that door was for, and to ensure that no one will ever have to darken its doorstep again. The Eureka Inn, it's my home. Complicated and beautiful and amazing. Drop in and see me at breakfast this weekend. You're always welcome. The front door will be open for you.
Thank you, Caitlin. And just let me say, we're all so glad to have your energy at the Eureka Inn. We love everything you're doing there, especially your weekly breakfast specials.
I love hearing these modern stories of leaders from our community, but they have a foundation for their work that has been built for over 200 years. Historian Ann Jeffelers Mason knows all about this from her work at the Heritage Alliance.
She sure does, Tom, and it looks like she's got some great stories about this foundation of leadership, which means it's time for another installment of
Ask the Historian.
Thanks, Lori. I do have some really interesting stories for this month. Stories about people who are no longer with us, but whose memories and accomplishments still are. College Hill Cemetery was founded by the Colored People's Cemetery Society in 1890. Prior to the cemetery's founding, space had been set aside in the Rocky Hill Cemetery for the burial of colored persons and strangers. The back slope that remains today is rough terrain, and except for depressions in the ground, there is no way to visibly tell that anyone was ever buried there. The markers are long gone, The paperwork is long gone, if there ever was any. The history is gone. Well, based on descriptions from early cemetery deeds, Graveyard Gordon Edwards has determined not only are there graves on that slope, but there are most likely graves under the road that is now Cemetery Lane.
But that answer brings up more questions, doesn't it, Anne? As someone who goes past the cemetery every day, I want to know, who was buried there? What was her story? What was his story?
Well, the founding of College Hill Cemetery in 1890 was progress. Here was a place to have records. Here was a place to have markers that would stand for hundreds of years. Here was a space for a community. Yes, Rocky Hill and College Hill cemeteries were segregated, but the very existence of College Hill was progress. Thanks to the cemetery and the tombstones, the paperwork, and the oral history, we know the stories of the people buried in College Hill.
One of my favorite stories from the College Hill Cemetery is of the 5 generations of one family. Do you know that story, Anne? I only heard some of it, but it would be good to hear more about it.
Oh yes, I know the one you're talking about. It began with Jeremiah Edwards and includes Amanda Bayless, Cordelia Cordy Brown, Lynn G. Brown, and Lynn D. Brown Jr. Born into slavery, Jeremiah Edwards went on to serve in the Union Army. He moved to Jonesborough after the war, and it was here that he helped establish the Zion Hill School for the African American community. During the cholera epidemic of 1873, he chose to stay in town and care for the sick. And in 1881, he was elected commissioner, a position he held for 3 years. Jeremiah Edwards wanted to be sure his children and his grandchildren would have more opportunities than he did. Was he successful? Let's hear from Amanda Bayless and Cordy Brown and find out.
All parents want more for their children than what they had. That's all we ever want. My name is Amanda Bayless. My father, Jeremiah Edwards, was born a slave in Greene County, Tennessee. In 1864, after he secured his freedom, he joined the Union Army and he fought for the freedom of all of his brothers and sisters. When the war was over, Daddy moved to Jonesborough. He purchased land on Zion Hill near the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. In that church, my daddy helped start a school. He raised money to make sure that his children and all future children could get an education. Because when he was growing up, when I was growing up, we weren't allowed to get an education. You see, I was born in 1850 when my daddy was still a slave. By law, I wasn't even his. We couldn't have anything, no education, and not even our own flesh and blood. The school in the Amy Zion Church, known back then as the School for Colored People, stayed there until about 1876. That's when the students relocated to the Warner Institute, a school for those recently freed from slavery. Now we take those things for granted, such as the right to an education, a legal wedding, a name, and even a birthright. My daddy vowed never to take anything for granted. He worked hard all the days of his life. He was a carpenter, and during the cholera epidemic in 1873, he stayed to help with the sick. Most people left, but Daddy stayed. When he died in 1906, he willed me all his property, saying, "She is my daughter, though not born in lawful wedlock. She was born to me when I was a slave, and I have always recognized her as my child, and she has always been kind and dutiful to me. She is my daughter." I married Commodore Bayless, and we had a daughter, Cordy. She is my daughter. She went to school right there at the Warner Institute. I told her, "Cordy, you are as smart as any white student, and you are as smart as any male student." In 1895, after she graduated from the Warner Institute, she became the first graduate from the school to be a teacher there. The Herald and Tribune reported she was the first one of her race that has ever been honored with the position of a teacher in this school, which is highly complimentary, not only to her, but also to the school. She is my daughter, and you best believe that article was on display in our house. All parents want a better life for their children. That's how the world keeps turning, and that's how we all progress.
Expectations, we all have them, and others have them of us. My name is Cordy Brown, and my family had high expectations for me, especially when it came to the education. There was reading. Queen Catherine wakes the cat, and the cat quietly cries. and pronunciation. Peter Pringle, the prickly pear picker, picked 3 perfectly prickly pears. And math, 6 times 1 is 6, 6 times 2 is 12, 6 times 3 is 18, and 6 times 4 is 24. 6 times 5 is 30. Spelling, Tennessee, Tennessee. And science, Archimedes Principle, states that the upward buoyant force that is exerted on a body immersed in a fluid, whether fully or partially submerged, is equal to the weight of the fluid that the body displaces and acts in the upward direction at the center of the mass of the displaced fluid. Latin, estimus. Do I really have to read all of this? I do, but it's a lot of work.
Something worth having is worth working for.
That was always my mother's answer, and I'd heard the story so many times as a child that I took it for granted. My grandfather was enslaved, owned by another. He fought his way to freedom, and then he fought in the Union Army to free others. After he was free, he claimed my mother as his daughter because he hadn't had a right to when she was born. It was illegal for my grandfather to get an education, and it was difficult for my mother. I was lucky because of where I lived here in Jonesborough. I had a school in my backyard, but there were so many others who still couldn't get an education. I had my family story memorized, and whenever I was frustrated with school, I sat down and I thought about it, really thought about it. What would it be like not to have a right to an education?
What are you doing with those books? It's not your place.
No, these are mine. This knowledge is mine. I have the right to it. Expectations, we all have them. I went to school right there at the Warner Institute. It was a school for the freedmen and their children. All our teachers were white, but the goal was to train new teachers for the African American community. I told my mama, I'm going to be the first black teacher at my school.
Something worth having is worth working for.
And I studied. I studied into the wee hours of the morning. Everything came second, friends, family, and boys. That was my goal, and I was going to reach it. And in 1895, at the start of the new school year, I was no longer a student or even an alumnus. I was a teacher. I did marry eventually. His name was Alfred Brown, and I didn't have to worry about whether or not our son could go to school. Education is a right, and no one can take it away from you. I'm Cordy Bayless Brown, and that's my school.
What an inspiring story, and from right here. You can visit Cordy's grave just by driving up Main Street. It's just up the hill from downtown Main Street, and it sits right next to her school, the red brick building that is still standing. The building is now privately owned and lovingly cared for as an important part of our history. Thank you, Anne, for another installment of Ask the Historian.
If you're just tuning in, you're listening to A Night with the Jonesborough Yarn Exchange on WETS 89.5 FM out of Johnson City, Tennessee.
Is a wonderful singing group that formed at Bethel Church several years ago. They perform all over the region, including the Umoja Festival in Johnson City. We're lucky enough to have them on our program tonight, so please help me welcome We Five.
It may fool your eyes, but it's actually 5 of us. It's just an illusion.
Ooh.
your name, 'cause I need you
Right now, Lord.
Well, I'm calling your name, 'cause I need you
Right now, Lord.
Well, sometimes I get tired, and sometimes I get weak. That's why I'm calling your